Hello, puppies and kittens. I am talking with someone who identifies as a biblical literalist, and he's given me a number of things that he believes, and that gives us a wealth of things that we could talk about. But one that interests me the most, as you could probably guess by these enclosures behind me, is when he said that he believes literally Genesis 3:14 and 15, where God cursed the descendants of the serpent to plague the descendants of Adam and vice versa, that the reason that snakes exist is because God cursed them to crawl on their bellies all the rest of his days or whatever. And so that's where snakes come from. Well, that opens up the topic of snake evolution, that I can explain evolution, like all of the issues with evolution, to somebody whose position would not require that he reject them. So, uh, Mick, what was good? There was a loud crashing.
That may be my chair. I have this metal folding chair.
Oh, okay.
People always notice it in work meetings too. So.
All right. So, let's just start with this. Like, what would be your objection to evolution if you have one?
None as a viable mechanism for the diversity of species, and no objections for it taking place now or in the last thousands of years. So it's not that I view a problem with any of the mechanisms. It's that I believe in there is something else affecting it, dabbling with it, tweaking it. And so it's a standalone process in my mind. It works fine. Some of the other objections that I hear believers mention, they don't know those. So I accept it. It's whether there is intervention.
Oh man, what I've read from you just opens up so many topics of discussion, and there's a lot of images that I wish I could share, but it's just there's not a way to do that effectively in this medium. I'm sorry to say. When we're talking about what you believe about snakes, you accept then that there are intermediate species, that there are transitional species?
Intermediate, definitely. Transitional may have added information that speaks to time, which that would need, to accept that, I would need some other argument in tandem with it.
Give me an example of what you're talking about.
If there was, well, to illustrate how much I would accept it, if you took me to a shaft, call it the shaft of evidence, and it's full of sediment, and we start digging, and there's someone very like a human, less like a human as we keep digging, all the way down to a perfect thing. I would recognize readily that that looks like these evolved one from the other, but just because a table looks old, it does not follow that the table is old. Something else would have to be argued there.
Okay, well, let me point this out. The first evidence of evolution was not what Darwin's work. The first evidence of evolution was people understood that you can breed different types of dogs and cats and cattle and pigeons and all of that sort of thing, and they knew that there was ways of blending new varieties. And then Carolus Linnaeus in 1735, he tried to classify all life, and he came up with the surprising thing, because he's a pre-Darwinian creationist, and he realized in his taxonomy that he has a hierarchy of ancestral or parent clades that did not match with creationism. They couldn't fall into what he was, what people commonly call created kinds. So there is no definition of a kind. The Bible gives min, meaning when you can take two organisms, breed them together, and produce after their own kind. That is the same as our biological concept of species.
Right. The kind meaning that's been the meaning that's been attached to kinds, I don't accept. Looking at those verses, there, even the phrase "after its kind," there's not enough information within that to convey the idea of speciation or the lack thereof.
Speciation.
Speciation.
Okay.
There's really nothing in that's language is not long enough to convey the idea that this is a species, that it can breed, that it cannot breed. I don't.
Well, I mean, if they can bring forth after their kind, does that not mean that you take a male and a female, you put them together, and they produce babies?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then that's bring forth after their own kind. That's the biological species concept.
Right, but that wouldn't preclude two creatures in one generation not being able to breed. So you could have it breeds after its kind, in the next generation it can't breed. Now we've got two new kinds. If you were taking it as that, I don't take it as anything more than it's saying all animals are one thing, because it's mentioned for all animals or all creatures, and then for man it's saying something else. So I only take that to mean that a raccoon is like a raccoon, but a man is like God in some sense, and it doesn't say there what sense that is.
Well, it does actually. It gives two definitions. Well, it depends on the stories you're reading. And if you're reading Greek mythology, then what distinguishes men from gods is that gods have control of fire. And so Prometheus was crucified to atone for the sins of man because he gave them forbidden knowledge by allowing them to know fire, and having the knowledge of fire made them like unto the gods. Whereas in Genesis 3, in Genesis 3, the serpent tells Eve that God is wrong, that God knows that you will not surely die when you eat this fruit. And he was right. The serpent was right. God was wrong there. God lied about that. The serpent pointed out that if you eat the fruit, you will become like unto gods, you knowing good from evil. That was the thing in that story. So knowing good from evil makes you like unto the gods. And then God himself, later in the same chapter, says the same thing. That if you're eating from the fruit, now they know good and eaten good and evil, now they are like unto me.
And even in Genesis 1, though, that saying, omitting after its kind for humans, could speak to the capacity to know evil, good from evil in the future, a moral sense as we know it.
Yeah, but then you also have to consider that what they deemed immoral was being naked. So somehow God made us immoral because he made us naked. And all of the other animals are okay with being naked, so they're still animals, but we suddenly realize, hey, this is immoral to be naked, which is weird. And so we have to wear clothes. And so that was the whole issue with morality, which is bizarre. So knowing good from evil means putting on clothes.
It's interesting. It definitely is.
Yeah. So anyway, I forgot where we were going with that. I seem to have sidetracked myself. So you mentioned something about speciation. You don't have a problem with speciation?
None at all.
Okay. So what we were talking about, I was telling you about Carolus Linnaeus. He knew that we could produce new varieties, new breeds of cattle, new breeds of dogs, cats, pigeons, and so on. But this classification system showed that it had been going on much longer than he could account for. And what he couldn't understand is it was easy enough to take two dogs or two pigeons and put them together and to get the traits that you want to derive from them. But how could you get beyond the species level? How could you get variation beyond to a different species? And so he had this quandary that he could not work out. And so he knew it was happening some way, but without a concept of evolution, he had no way to explain it. And so 100 years later, Darwin comes along and proposes natural selection as the first of several mechanisms to explain how evolution works. And the book On the Origin of Species, because the whole issue was, how do you get a new species out of that? If you can breed them, but there's a point where they cannot interbreed anymore. How do you get new variety out of that? And so Darwin gives the first example of how new varieties come. And then later, Gregor Mendel shows how genetics, and I think Hugo de Vries gives mutations, and now we have mechanisms upon mechanisms to show how biodiversity happens. So evolution is often described as, or misrepresented as being like the origin of life, or it's the origin of the universe, or like it's a whole different religion or whatever. But really, it's just the scientific explanation of biodiversity, how populations diversify.
Yes.
Like we have the image of the different snakes that I showed you a moment ago before we started this recording, where you have one population and you have a new variety emerge out of that population. That evolution is a population level change, which is another thing that people very often don't understand. Like, how do you get it's never that there's a first person, or there's never like a first anything by itself. It's always a population of things, and you can see how if you were to take one population and divide it into two different groups, then in just a few generations you would be able to tell whether you had some lone interloper between the two groups, that you would know which of the groups it came from, because in just a few generations enough mutations build up between either one so that they can become distinct and be identified for which group they come from. And then as these changes continue, as they remain separated, eventually their genetic diversity is such that they can't interbreed anymore. So I mean, it gets to a point where they can produce hybrids, and maybe the hybrids are infertile, and then later on they're just not viable at all. They can't even produce anything. And by this time, now they are separate species. They're still part of the same parent group. And there's another interpretation of kind that applies to that. So you could imply a kind to be the same thing as a clade, which in this case would be all of snakes, for example. You can have clades within clades, like in the phylogenetic tree. That's how that works. But you can't have kinds within kinds, because the idea of a kind is, God creates this special group, poofs that out of nothing, and then everything it diversifies from there. You mentioned also that you accept that the millions of species that we have were derived from just thousands of species on Noah's Ark, and so you accept that they evolved from whatever original ones were on Noah's Ark, right? That was your position?
How to put this? Well, how I view matter and consciousness is that one affects the other. One hosts the other. One is the hardware, one is the software. I believe consciousness is the hardware and matter is the software. So when it gets to like Noah's Ark, maybe there was 1,000 types on there, or 1,000 different animals even, let's say. And then after that, it could be natural evolution as described by you, or accelerated when I believe that the matter is directly affected by consciousness. Well, there's no requirement for time. Accelerated evolution is not strange in my mind.
I hear many creationists tell me that they accept microevolution, but they reject macroevolution. The irony being that they usually have it reversed. They refuse to admit that mutations are the ultimate source of new information in the genome. So technically they reject microevolution, and they say that they fully accept speciation, not just that new species can evolve, but Kent Hovind and Ken Ham and them, that they will say that new genus can evolve, a new family, and even up to a new order can evolve. These can all be accounted for by evolution, but that's speciation and up is exactly what macroevolution is. So all these creationists that say that they accept microevolution but reject macroevolution, they actually accept macro and reject micro, but they don't know what either one is.
I wouldn't know the difference, but I would accept any injection of information into DNA, anything, would be the equivalent in your mind of me adding a thought to another thought in the ease of manipulating the other one.
Did you say injecting DNA?
Yes. Just write a bit, paste it in, like code, writing code for computers.
Okay, so you don't. Your problem is you don't accept new information.
I would accept new information. I don't know how many creatures were 7,000 years ago, 6,000 years before, but the possibilities are endless when you think or accept that consciousness creates matter. Not creates it, I wouldn't assert something that strong, but it affects it.
Okay. I don't understand how, and I'll be frank, nobody has ever proposed how a mechanism by which consciousness can affect population genetics. So I mean, we know that mutations happen. We know how that happens, and so we know how it generates new information. But there's nothing about consciousness in there.
If it's easy to accept that matter creates consciousness, where is the hang-up and the other way around? I know we won't understand the mechanisms. Well, let me ask it, just to dispose it from the ground up. If matter exists and consciousness exists, would you accept both of those propositions?
I do accept that if you want to say matter, that there's certain that consciousness is an aspect of life. So it's not just matter; it has to be matter that is alive to generate any degree of consciousness at all. And that consciousness, I'm not going by David Chalmers' weird thing about having, where you have like zero consciousness until you get to this many neurons and then flip a switch and now you have 100% consciousness. His hard problem is that it's a fallacy. It's more of a dial. So you have consciousness that's very, very, very dim, and you get more and more and more as it goes up. So you can have a unicellular organism that displays consciousness, just not perfect consciousness. It's vague, it's dim, and then you have trillions of neurons working together in a collective, and now they're going to have a whole lot more consciousness.
Let me run an idea by you, get your thoughts on that. So if every bit of matter or energy, whatever state you're thinking of it in, it has the attribute of consciousness to some extent. Maybe it becomes emergent and complex as we know it. But if every bit of matter has some consciousness, wouldn't the entire material universe or cosmos have the highest consciousness?
If it's an aspect of life, and life is exceedingly rare in this universe, then it would appear not. It's not just that life is rare in this universe. It's that every world that would have life, and so far we only know of one, and what we have is not the life that we have. We have like one highly intelligent sapient species, and there's a handful of other sapient species that don't have our attributes, so they can't expand on that the way we did. Elephants are very smart, but they have a trunk. They don't have hands. Dolphins are very smart, but they live in the water and don't have hands.
I love the videos of elephants or dolphins interacting. It's
yeah. And so you have these animals that have the base to work with, as far as the brain to work with, but they don't have the body that is required to match the brain. And then it's frustrating to me because you have also things like raccoons. We've all seen Guardians of the Galaxy, right? We have raccoons that are there. They can walk bipedally. They still have thumbs. They have wrists that turn like this. They have the type of body that could really benefit from a hyper intelligence. but they also have a really slow mutation rate, unfortunately. So they evolve very, very slowly,
Would,
which is frustrating.
if you accept that the attribute of consciousness is, a part of life, cellular life, do you believe that consciousness is a part of anything else? Leading to, do you think AI, electronic computers, could ever be conscious?
Yes, I do think that computers could achieve consciousness.
So it would not be cellular life specifically?
I don't think it has to be. If you've got something that's designed to think, then eventually it's going to get good at thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had this argument with somebody when a computer is processing, which processing equals thinking. That's what it's doing. When it does the little circle or whatever the timeout was back in 2004 when I had this conversation, I'm telling the customer, okay, well, the computer's thinking, just give it a moment. And the guy got upset. His superiority over machines, whatever. It's not thinking. Like, okay, well, when the system says it's processing and you don't want to use the word thinking, what word could you use that won't make you feel insecure?
That's a good point. There's a meaningful
Yeah.
Or,
So I think
they play around with computers based on water flow or ping pong balls, stuff like that. So the basic gates and ands and everything, they can do the simple problem solving with any number of medium, any media. And then because AI can mimic things like almost personality traits, emotions, it can mimic that in electric computers. I don't see anything preventing the creation of the replication of an entire human brain in a ping pong ball computer.
Okay, well, I don't. We were talking about the replication of a human brain. I don't know why we would do that, nor we wouldn't want to or need to.
As a thought experiment only, and that is if AI can show emotions in that, like there's a threat, so the system says have anxiety as a marker. If AI can mimic emotions, that's with ones and zeros of electricity on or off. So a ping pong ball computer could create the same thing. So you could have a ping pong ball computer that operates exactly like a human brain. It responds. It has memories. If it could be conscious, where is its consciousness sitting, I guess? Between the ping pong balls?
I don't understand what you're saying.
Do you accept the proposition that they could make a computer out of ping pong balls?
What I'm talking about is chemical. So the consciousness that we perceive in unicellular organisms is from their chemical matrices. So that they're able to understand the changes in their chemical environment. And I don't see a ping pong ball being able to perceive changes in its chemical environment or having a chemical environment. So you're kind of, I don't know, I understand the you may be talking about something that maybe everybody knows about this ping pong ball, whatever this thing is, but I haven't seen it, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, you believe that or accept that electronic computers could be conscious?
Yes, but it how do I put this? One of the advantages of an electronic computer over a human brain is that you ever do the thing with the computer where you have to discharge capacitors back in the day in order to get okay. So the human brain kind of stores everything in that static charge. You discharge the caps and then it's done. With a computer, you can take out the hard drive, put it in another system, and as long as the hardware is compatible, then that thing will still work. All of the data will still be saved. But you can't do that with a human brain. So you can't extract The data, there's no aspect of you, yourself, your consciousness, your memories. None of that can be stored, can be transmitted, can be saved. But with a computer, you can kill the machine, and as long as the hard drive itself is not damaged, you can save all of that data, put it in another machine.
Now, in the brain, I know nothing about chemicals, but I'm sure that the information will be kept in a chemical state. Am I right in thinking that?
I would think so, yes. If it's going to be true, if it's going to have a real consciousness, then I think it has to have an awareness not just of the things that it's thinking about, but also of itself. And maybe that's the problem that we're having trouble communicating right now. When I'm thinking about an artificial intelligence, we're talking about something that doesn't have a body.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not going to be aware of itself. It kind of doesn't have a self in that sense. It's just aware of its own thoughts, because I think that's at least a theoretical possibility, maybe a philosophical possibility, but I don't see where that's relevant to what we're talking about.
I accept the idea of a consciousness. I don't know if you would call it a substance, but there is something that we have not yet defined, learned about, that is in addition to the material body. That'd be my position on.
Well, I have to go the other way, because I've spoken with a number of neurophilosophers and at least a half a dozen neuroscientists who all have the same position, that there is no mind-body dualism. We don't have a soul. There is no supernatural aspect that is animating our bodies. We are our bodies, and that's it, and that's all. And that once the brain is sufficiently damaged, where the brain can be chemically altered, and it will alter chemically or physically altered, and it'll alter the personality. Whereas if you had a soul, you would expect certain things to be different. There would be a way to test for that, even with material science. Even if it's an immaterial supernatural soul, we would still be able to test for that by material supernatural means. And what we come up with instead is something that seems devoid of that the idea of a soul is pure fiction. There isn't one.
That would be where my curiosity goes, in that we say we cannot see it, and to the point where we could take a dog, a human, a computer, AI, a mechanical computer, anything, and if they were complex enough and simple enough to standardize the test against them, they could all be showing the exact same response, fear or happiness. But do they all experience consciousness? Do they all feel what is going on? That's where my curiosity leads.
Well, again, we're talking about something. Do they all feel? That depends on whether they have something to feel with. If you're talking about if you're talking about an AI computer system that maybe exists on a network of different systems, so it doesn't have a body, which is another difference between computers and life. You can have a singular consciousness that could be networked on a whole bunch of different systems.
Right.
And it's independent of all those individual bodies.
Yes.
Exactly. So it wouldn't have feeling in the same way. Is it aware of things in a different capacity? I think that's possible. Again, I don't see where it's relevant to what we're talking about.
Well, back to more evolution and what parts of it I accept and I do not. My question for you would be, what led you to believe that matter came before consciousness?
That what?
What leads you to believe that matter came before consciousness?
That the product of matter became the product of matter?
Or consciousness emerged from matter and not matter emerged from consciousness.
Right. How did I'm trying to figure out a way to reverse that in a way that so you would understand how it's reversed. I don't know how. The product of the brain does not pre-exist the brain that created it. All consciousness is a product of not just material, but living material. And so you can't have dead material have any perceptible consciousness. How could it?
But from the other side, I could say that all matter is an emergent property of consciousness.
Well, you're also saying that you want to separate consciousness from all matter. And now we have a something that can't exist doesn't exist in the absence of anything that does exist.
I would not, because I don't know, I wouldn't take a strong enough position that I would say that consciousness is not matter or something matter-like. I don't know what it is. I'm just identifying consciousness as something different apart from what we've already identified with our sense perception. There's something else, and it's consciousness.
I'm not seeing it. I mean, we have an understanding of what consciousness is and how it's developed in living things. I don't see how we can have consciousness exist by itself without a thing to create it. Without anything to create.
Well, how can we have matter exist by itself without anything to create it?
Matter doesn't need consciousness.
How do we know the difference between that and the statement consciousness doesn't need matter?
Because consciousness is a product of matter that is alive.
How do we tell these two scenarios apart? So one scenario would be that consciousness is the hardware, matter is the software. The other is
you have to show that software exists.
Sorry, that I didn't catch that.
Show me that the software exists.
The consciousness?
Well, that's what you're talking about. As I said,
yes.
Neuroscientists and neurophilosophers, they say it doesn't exist. Now, these are the experts. I'm not an expert in this field, so I'm not going to argue, but that's what they say.
Okay. Do you think that we're obligated to accept whatever position we have the most certainty about?
That's a weird way to phrase that question. I don't know how it's intended. Are we, say it again, are we obligated to accept?
So if we came to a question where there's two possibilities, two suspects, and we, as far as we can tell, we cannot tell the difference between them. Okay. What do we choose off of? Neither one of us think it's emotion, like, oh, I have a liking toward this. So what do we use to decide one against the other? Would you agree that it is the level of certainty we have?
Which is more strongly or better supported than the other?
That's why
I prefer to continue to consider both if both are possible.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
If you can't show that one of them is possible, if you can't show the possibility, then there isn't anything more to talk about.
I agree. I 100% agree with that.
Okay, so a disembodied consciousness, an immaterial consciousness, is an unsupported assertion. There's not even a possibility to discuss.
What about Descartes, though?
Descartes, it bothers me that he is famous for something he said that he contradicted later in the same book.
Fair enough.
I think, therefore I am. And then later in the same book, he decides that he's not necessarily real. The only thing he could be sure of is that God is real, that he may not be real. I wish I could remember the exact way he said it, because it's important how it's.
No, I think you got the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'll have to go back and read it again just to remember how it was phrased. But it bothered me that the only thing he could be certain of is something that isn't true at all. And that's just annoying. That anybody quotes him after he says something like that is also annoying. And how Descartes figures into the evolution of snakes is perplexing. But go ahead.
Well, I want to find truth, and you do too. You've committed your life to that. You would say things like believers just believe without rationale. And I want you to test me on that. That's why I'm so honored to be here, because you've thought about this from a bunch of angles. So I could run by why I believe, and then
Sorry,
you
my
can
dog.
oppose it.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Well, yes.
why I believe is because I know consciousness exists. That's my whole experience. That's how I know everything. I believe the material world exists. For consciousness, I have certainty. For the material world, I believe it, I accept it, but I don't have the same level of certainty. So the proposition that matter exists or consciousness existed and matter existed on top of it has a higher level of certainty than matter existing and consciousness existing as an emergent property of it. One of those is more certain. So that's what I believe.
Okay, but you're also a biblical literalist.
Yes.
Looking for truth.
Yes.
Okay. But you're not a flat earther.
No.
But then you're not a very strict literalist.
I could accept that. Yeah.
Okay. So if you're looking for truth, here's of all the things that we're talking about. You want to talk about some lofty philosophical things. We know that Adam and Eve are not possible, genetically impossible. This is according to traditional Christian geneticists. Kenneth Miller and Francis Collins both agree that Adam and Eve are impossible, genetically impossible. And he's a traditional Catholic, and the other one's an evangelical. And they're experts in their field. One of them is a textbook author on evolutionary science, and he was the star witness in Kitzmiller versus Dover. So again, I'm side with them. We know that the Garden of Eden is a parable. It's a fable with a moral. We know what other stories it was based on, that it was, it borrows tropes from other surrounding mythology that was older, and they just integrated that and adapted it to a new God. So the Genesis fable is not as old as you might think it is. It's something in the neighborhood of 400 or 500 BCE.
Well, I got this one from you, and that is that things like truth is what can be shown to be true. Reality, yes. Reality is real. All those ones, and I accept all of those. As you demonstrate to me that Adam and Eve are not possible, you could go, they do not appear possible from all we can see. Take that as one premise. Then it goes immediately to a conclusion that, therefore, it's impossible. So it appears some way, therefore it is some way. And that doesn't demonstrate it to me. That doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur, where there would have to be some other premise to make that conclusion true.
I don't get it. To clarify what you're saying, please.
Oh, how do we know that evolution is true? Like that it actually happened?
Because we can watch it. We can measure it, test it, repeat it. We can demonstrate it, observe it. We can manipulate it. We have depended on evolutionary principles throughout the entire history of agriculture. We depend on it for toxicology and virology and disease control. We have to understand how evolution works.
So I would grant that it appears true and it works now. Those both are demonstrated. You could demonstrate them in many ways. But in order for it to have actually happened over millions of years, you would need another premise, which is something like nothing has interfered. Like it appears true, nothing has interfered, therefore it actually happened. Okay. There's a missing unspoken premise there that I'm trying to tease out because I want to make progress in the conversation.
Yeah. So that I think gets me back to the topic that I opened this up with. I didn't expect that we would actually talk about snakes very long, but I'm happy that we're back to that. I think we're talking about the one situation in the Bible describes where we have an actual true clade right down to the last common ancestor, that being the serpent in the garden. Now we know that the serpent in the garden didn't really exist, but we can get into that later. Let's just talk about from there. You know that there are currently somewhere between 3,900 and 4,000 species of snakes. And that's just among what lives now. And they didn't just fan out, a bunch of different ones. It wasn't like 4,000 different descendant lines. It's 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, 32, 64, so on. Excepting for those random lines that go extinct. And so they proliferate, and they spread all over the world. And these differences with each descendant group, like with snakes, the first ones were these like worm-like blind snakes. These are the most primitive that we have. And you can see that with the taxonomy. You can also see it with the genetics. The worm snakes develop into, or I don't want to say develop into, but the next more primitive line, there's actually a lot of different intermediates. There's a lot of transitionals in here, just in the existing snakes, not even going with the fossil record, just with the stuff that we have now. We then get into like things like henophiids. I'm skipping a lot of things.
No, I accept all of this. I do.
Yeah. Your boas and your and pythons. Pythons have the heat pits, and they lay eggs, and the boas don't have heat pits, but they give live birth. And then you get into another whole category that, again, there are transitional intermediate morphological groups that get into something called the colubroids, which is like 80% of the species that we have on the earth today. Again, 3,000 species of snakes. And they get into the more advanced type of snakes, where they've lost their left lung, they've lost their left carotid artery, they've of course lost their legs, they've lost their eyelids, they've lost their inner ears, and they start doing these other specialized adaptations. We have some fossil snakes that don't have the ability to swallow things bigger than their head. And then we get into the macrostomata, where their jaws are separated and they have this band between them so they can swallow things as big as they are.
Right.
And you have these other adaptations where they now have heat pits, and they now have different senses than other snakes do. You have new information. You mentioned that new information can't come out of nowhere. We have some in this colubroid category. We have that like vipers that have the heat pits, and rattlesnakes, which is one subset of the vipers. They have the rattle, and these are like little add-on scales that grow on every year, which makes that rattle sound. Then we have the tentacled snake, which is another subset that has these 2 prongs that they use for sensing in the water. This is another a new feature. Now, if you accept that all snakes were evolved from this one common ancestor, then there's a handful of these type traits. The dragon snakes that has these huge ridges down the side. There's a handful of others I'm losing at the moment. And then there's also let me see. Yeah. The fangs. Fangs are important. In the pythons and boas don't have fangs. None of those other fangs do. We do not until we get into the colubroids. The basal colubrids have rear fangs. And that's what's interesting about that is that vipers and elapids, that's your coral snakes, cobras, and all of the really, really, really deadly snakes that aren't vipers, all of them stem from this type of rear-fanged colubrid type. And there's a study, and I gave you a link for that if you want to see it, but there's a study in the development of fangs where they use embryology to show how the genes are expressed in different species of snakes. And vipers and elapids and lampriphiids all the front-fanged ones all start from a rear-fanged position. And there's a mutation that happens in their development that in the vipers and elapids separately, different mutations, move the fangs to the front in different ways. So your elapids, the cobras and coral snakes and all of that, they have fangs that stick down front, and they can't move. They're just like regular teeth. But the vipers, they have a different type of mutation that, again, moved their fangs to the front, but hinged so that they could have ridiculously long fold-out teeth. But we're showing how in their embryological development, how these mutations kind of happen. So these is new information, new adaptations that also are correlated with the venom glands. And of course, there's different types of venom that these things can develop. So all of this is new information that would have occurred since their common ancestor.
Yes, I can see that.
Okay. So that gets us into whole different categories, like different families, several different families of snakes, getting into however many, different genera and 4,000 species, just among the ones that are still alive. Another question that I get from creationists often is that they say that there's no such thing as vestigial traits, and they know about the cloacal spurs on pythons, which pythons have these. They have leg bones, and they have like a single claw around their cloaca, and they can use these in mating sometimes, but they're not really necessary anymore. Older snakes, fossil snakes, don't just have the spurs; they have actual legs, hind legs.
I didn't know that.
There are 4 species of snakes in the fossil record that have hind legs, but their hind legs, they don't have front legs. They haven't found one. They haven't found a 4-legged snake yet, but they found 4 2-legged snakes. And the ones that have hind legs, the legs are so very tiny that you have to zoom in on it to see them at all. They are itty bitty. So the definition of a vestigial trait is that it's a vestige of what it once was, that it has a diminished capacity to perform its original function. Perhaps it has no capacity to perform its original function, and at best, it might be able to achieve some secondary function. And so the legs on these snakes, that's a vestigial trait. Another one is that some snakes in the colubrid category, they've lost their left lung. That's all colubrid snakes have lost their left lung. They've all lost the left carotid artery, but some of them have a skull that has a hole for the carotid artery, even if they don't have the artery anymore. Which is another example of vestigial trait. Now, other creationists would argue against all of that, but in your position, you would have no reason to doubt any of it, right?
No, I got to take whatever information I get, and yeah, I accept that 100%. It's not just you saying it. I mean, you know more than most I've heard from, but I accept that 100%. The mechanism, the validity of the mechanism.
Now, there is one other thing. You mentioned that you didn't accept that there should be any animals prior than 6,000 years ago. And
correct.
There's a bunch of problems with that. One is that the notion of that was come up with for the 6,000 years was when the biggest problem is that the Bible is a storybook, and it's not history. It's not the Word of God. It's not history. But apart from that, even if we were to say that it was, Bishop Ussher counts up these people, and he come up with a couple of different dates, not just for the creation of the world. But if you want to take his date for the creation of the world, then you also have to take his date for the flood.
Okay.
And his date for the flood was I can't remember when it was. It was much more recent. It was much more recent than even young Earth creationists could accept, because you had so many well-established histories in so many different nations that they'd like, no, we need to change this one, come up with a different number. They generally agree on the 24th century BC somewhere.
I would accept that.
Okay, but we know of all these different civilizations with their means of writing already existing in different parts of the world that continue right on through.
And I can accept it appears that way. Where my sticking point where it asks for help is our running syllogism is still that something appears a certain way, therefore it is a certain way, and that doesn't demonstrate it to me.
Okay. So I'm fine with that, because I mean, actually, that's the way science is done. They tend not to prove anything in the positive sense. There's a rule against that. So a lot of creationists will say that evolution has never been proven. Well, it depends on what you mean by proven. If you're talking about mathematic proof, which science considers proof to be exclusively mathematic, then no. Atomic theory will never be proven. But that doesn't mean that chemistry doesn't work, because we know it does. That doesn't mean that atomic energy doesn't work, because it definitely does. So we know that, atomic theory is a fact, not necessarily proven, because proof only exists in mathematics. However, when people talk about, proving their theory, they're talking about a different context. And in general, they mean something like by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. And by that terminology, yes, evolution has been proven and can be repeatedly.
Well, and I accept that to the extent where, if as a Bible believing Christian, if you ask me about teaching evolution in schools, science is to describe the material world. And if it is, you should describe it how it looks. I don't see a reason why not to. I guess it just doesn't tell me why. It doesn't prove to me that it actually happened. It's just that it looks like it happened millions of years ago.
Okay. The first evidence of evolution, again, was taxonomy. And when you look at the detail of that, it's quite vast. If we were to just focus on the detail of the taxonomy of snakes, that alone is quite vast. It's I wrote up a cladogram when I started the Phylogeny Explorer project. We started it for the first 2 or 3 years trying to do it all by hand. And for the last 3 years, I've been trying to work on a computer upgrade that has unfortunately taken the whole project offline indefinitely, which is frustrating beyond belief. But anyway, we were doing these by hand, and I had to do one for colubroids, and I was stunned at I personally logged in like thousands of species in their appropriate positions according to peer-reviewed articles. It was enormous, the taxonomy for this. And it's, as I said, it's always in a hierarchy, which does not fit with the biblical story of creating all these different things and the kinds of categorizations they used. For example, a created kind. God creates this thing, they evolve from that point. But with the first serpent, that already existed.
Yes.
God cursed it so that it lost its legs and had to crawl on its belly. But that just means that it was a lizard. Lots of lizards have lost their legs, and particularly lizards, more squamates than any other reptile. But doesn't make them snakes. Just because a lizard doesn't have snakes or doesn't have legs doesn't mean that it's a snake. A snake is a particular group. And so God just cursed this one lizard. And so you said that there shouldn't be any common ancestry. Well, snakes have, even in your perspective, common ancestry with lizards.
I can accept that. I 100% can.
Okay. So I'm at a loss to figure out where you are in why you believe what you believe.
I think with science and all its applications, we would be on the same page. It looks this way, it appears this way, so if it's not broken, don't fix it. When I get to the question of, I like to live, so I would either want to freeze my brain for future technology to revive, or I love life, or I want to believe, so I want to do one of those two things. I need to pick between those. How do I make that choice?
I only heard one of them. You want to freeze your brain, or
I believe what Christ said, that there is life after this. I want one of those things. If neither one of them are possible or work, okay, but I want to try for it, and I want to pick wisely.
Okay. I don't want an eternal afterlife. That's a horror story that I would seek to escape. Even if you didn't have a concept of hell, which, by the way, was the first religious concept that I had to abandon as a child. I realized that hell was inconsistent with God. But the idea that when you die, you're not really dead, that you still exist in some other capacity.
Right.
And it goes on forever, and there's no way to.
It's the stuff of nightmares until you think that. Imagine you were fulfilled as you never dreamed you could be. You're happy. You're loving life. You're passionate about something. Right at that moment, do you want it to end? And if you continue on like that, what moment would you want it to end? You never would. You learn more and more. You create more.
But you can't. That's what infinity means. You can only go so far. You can only learn so much. And we're not allowed to do any of that because we're told that we have to praise this inexplicably insecure God for all of eternity.
If that is singing, okay, I'm with you. But who says it's singing? Because the things that
Who says it's what?
Singing, like we're gonna singing songs for eternity. Worship songs.
Okay, well, I just mean sing praises. I don't mean the actually have to sing them. But just you're supposed to praise God forever.
Can't you praise him by creating new snakes?
Why would God need to be praised?
Because it's fair. That's the.
It's fair.
Yeah.
He knows everything, right?
Yeah.
Does he know what he's good at? Does he need me to oh, you did a good job there? Really? If I was a God, I would not care if any particular ant praised me. Why would it matter? I'm not dependent on that. I'm not insecure. I'm comfortable in who I am. I'm healthy. I don't need any sycophants praising me. Any being worthy of worship would not want to be worshipped.
I see it as fair in the fact that if you have a perfect and perfectly loving being,
which the Bible clearly contradicts.
Well, let's just take the theory. Let's take the theory. You have a perfect being. The fair thing would be that all other beings reflect this perfection, this creativity, this joy, this love. They would reflect it, and that is the praise. And that would be the best thing to them to be reflecting or doing the highest and the most noble things. That's the theory.
Okay, so you wanted to talk about the things that are supported, the things that are not supported. It looks like that, so we'll go with that. That's probably what it is. We don't have to make a choice. We've got that this is indicated, this is not. Maybe this is possible, but it's not indicated, so we're going to go with this. Okay, but you believe the Bible.
Yes.
You throw out everything we know about every type of radiometric dating, every type of isotope, as well as all of the other means that don't even use radioisotopes, all of the other ways of dating the Earth that all exceed 10,000 years. You throw out everything we know about the molecular clock. You throw out everything we know about taxonomy, dendrochronology, everything. All of these ways that are used all over the world at every geological site, every paleontological dig, everything consistently showing this great age in favor of a story written by nobody knows who that we're told we have to believe or else.
For the dating methods and everything, so I believe that creation happened before the 6 days, during the 6 days, and after. Genesis 6:3 speaks of a software update downgrade from to 120 years of life. So I believe in constant intervention. At each point of that, light is traveling from the stars. It's created from the stars. The trees that were created have rings. There's dead trees under the trees that have rings themselves. Everything you imagine happen, or take a snapshot 6,000 years ago, that was created exactly the way your snapshot looks. That's my belief.
But if we went back 6,000 years ago,
yes,
we would have tribal nomads living all over North and South America. We would have people sailing to Taiwan. We would have Aboriginal people all over Australia, and your God didn't exist yet.
Help me with that. How do we know that there were people back then? Does it appear that there were people back then?
Well, yes, we have. If you study the anthropology, my degree is in anthropology. If you study the archaeology of any given area, they're always going to go back beyond 6,000 years. The history of everywhere is older than 6,000 years, except I think Taiwan. I think Taiwan was only being just inhabited 6,000 years ago, and maybe not New Zealand either. New Zealand, I don't think, was inhabited quite by 6,000 years ago.
Uh-huh.
But North and South America, definitely both. And with the artifacts found, say in South America, so there's a body found that's radiometrically dated to, I can't remember the numbers exactly. I want to say it was like 12,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
But the more important thing, so you have somebody that's living there 12,000 years ago, and their genetics match the people that still live there now.
I accept that. I do.
Okay, that disputes the flood. Everything disputes the flood, but that's just one example.
Right, but my position is that the consciousness of one or more entities is affecting how the world is. The world is consistent, it's real, but it's being affected. So anytime that something looks a certain way, I say, okay, I take it at face value, but that doesn't mean that it always looked that way. If it looks 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years old, it doesn't mean that it existed 10,000 years ago.
All right. So if it looks like that, I mean, we have the evidence, we have all this evidence, and then we have nothing for the other side. I mean, nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
We have absolutely everything disproving the global flood, for example. And what a horrible God would that be if he did the flood? We'll just throw that out. And the Tower of Babel, that's another one that we know did not happen. We're certain of that. We know what did happen, and it wasn't that. But if that was true, I mean, again, what a dick would God have to be? Oh, humans can get together and accomplish things. Let me fuck that up. Because I don't want these people to get all high and mighty and think they're as good as me. What kind of insecure bastard is this God? But he's only like that in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. I see where you're coming from on that.
Yeah.
Taking the Tower of Babel as an example, would those people have been better if that was all humanity at the time? Just assuming that as a theory, that's all the people.
Which we know it wasn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, take the proposition, the narrative that all of humanity is living on a plane. Would they be safer all living in one place on a plane? Would they be better insulated to natural disasters if they had spread out across the world? Of course, that's in the narrative.
You said that was part of the Tower of Babel.
Yes.
Okay. So around 1700, 1750 BCE,
sure.
There's a tower being built under the rule of Hammurabi, in which we already know the entire world was populated, even Australia,
mm-hmm.
and the other languages existed all over the place before the Tower of Babel. That's all you don't want me to say that is the fact, but I mean, that's all the facts indicate.
Okay. Yeah. Or it appears that way or anything like that.
Yeah. So what do we have to support the story? We got a whole lot to contradict it. We have the evolution of languages to
mm-hmm.
contradict it. I mean, we know how all these different languages are related to each other and how languages evolve in a very analogous way to the way species evolve. We know that 1700 BCE, there were already people in China. The Indu language was already being used. There's written documents from other places in the world that are before. Well, in 17, yes, I think so. Not sure off the top of my head about what other written languages there were. But we know that people were living all over the world. We know how languages evolve very quickly, especially in isolated groups, just like with biological things.
When I look up the oldest surviving building structures that humans created, there are some that date back prior to 6,000 years. But, and I wouldn't camp on this point or assert it or anything, only to say that if the oldest building is, let's say, 10,000 years old and it's just a pile of stones, even accepting there is no intervention in the material world, you look at that and it looks within the range of the biblical narrative. Like, I don't see extant writing.
I don't see anything in the range of the biblical narrative. You understand, we started this conversation, like intending to talk about snakes, although we really didn't talk about snakes very much.
Well, I accept all that snake stuff.
Yeah, you understand that snakes can't talk, right?
Not if that is the only thing. So if there is nothing else at play, snakes cannot talk. I accept that.
You want to talk about things that fit the biblical narrative. Snakes don't talk. Fruit will not give you knowledge. There's no such thing as a magical enchantment, whether it's a blessing or a curse. So magic isn't real. So where there's not a thing that aligns with or that supports the biblical story. Nothing, whatever, at all. We do have a lot of other things we can go over in detail that talk about the actual age of all these other things and how to deal with these. How 6,000 years ago, your Bible didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
The people your Bible talks about didn't exist. 4,000 years ago, the Bible didn't exist. The people that it talks about didn't exist.
The examples you gave, though, like a talking snake, they are absurd if you take it from one scenario and move it over to the other scenario and then judge it according to that scenario. We're looking at two possible scenarios, either consciousness and matter or matter and consciousness. And so what internally doesn't fit in Scripture?
I asked you what fits.
I go from, I have a consciousness, so there's a meaningful consciousness in existence somewhere.
Okay, but what matches the Bible? What can you show to be actually factually true that supports anything in the Pentateuch, for example, or Job, or any of the Hebrew Bible?
I would look into that if it wasn't for things like Genesis 6:3, which show intervention throughout from Genesis to Revelation. And if there's intervention in that scenario, there's intervention all throughout. Even if there was something like a prophecy that this appears to be true, well, things could have changed all throughout. There could have been meddling or interference. So I don't use that as a proof for myself.
Okay, so I asked you for anything that was actually factually true and supportive of the Bible.
Let's say nothing at this point, because in my journey for truth, first I get to the Bible, and then I believe everything the Bible says. At this point,
so you're not actually interested in truth at all. You're interested in believing in the Bible, regardless whether it's true or not.
Once I'm convinced the Bible is true, I will believe everything it says.
So you're not interested in truth at all?
I am. And
the truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true. You're not finding that. There's no truth in the books that I was just talking about. None. You just said nothing. I asked you, what is actually factually true? The truth that you can show me that is supportive of the Bible. You said nothing.
I haven't looked for it because that would not be a proof to me.
You said that you look for truth, but then you say that you haven't looked for truth. You just look for believing the Bible, regardless, and you will throw out all the information, all of the evidence that indicates something else, admitting there is no evidence that indicates what you believe.
So let's take the Bible out of it. I would still be left with a belief in a supreme consciousness.
Why?
Because I know I have Cartesian certainty that consciousness exists in some sense.
We already discussed how inept Cartesian certainty is. The man was certain and then changed his mind in the course of the same book.
Okay, let's not take him. Let's just think it out. Epistemology. What do we know? What we know is our consciousness exists. And we want truth. We want to know the nature of. We look at the world.
How do you determine what is truth?
By certainty, and I know that is a arbitrary.
You determine truth by certainty?
Yes.
Isn't that a way to prevent yourself from determining truth?
No, I look for what is the most certain, and I go with that. That is an arbitrary choice
The
on my
most
part.
certain.
The certainty is that something exists. Would
But
you agree with
people are
that?
certain about things that they're wrong about all the time.
Okay, we could just talk between us. Do you believe that consciousness exists?
Consciousness is something we perceive. I mean, to that degree, it exists. I mean, we feel this consciousness thing. We have that is a perception. So yeah, in that capacity, it exists. But just because you have certainty of something doesn't mean it's true.
And that's
I had an extremely passionate argument with somebody who was yelling at me that if some little old lady was yelling at me that she remembered when the Beatles came over here in 1955. That she also said that was when Star Trek came out with a TV series. She said that was in 1955. She says all these things happened in 1955. I'm like, no, we can just look this up. You know, the Beatles came over here in 1964. Star Trek started in 1966. You can look it up. And this was before the internet, so it wasn't that easy to do. But she's absolutely adamant that she knows that she knows. She's completely certain. She's wrong, but she's completely certain. So certainty will hide the truth, but not illuminate it.
what do we use as
Uncertainty will more likely reveal. Get yourself to question whether something is true. How would you find out whether it is true? So let's take certainty out of it, because we realize certainty just leads to a lie.
Okay.
Let's not be certain. Let's find another way. Be uncertain.
Okay.
How do we find out what's true?
By what you can demonstrate as true. I agree with you on that.
Okay.
So I can demonstrate that something exists. Would you agree with that?
Something exists, yes.
Yes. My consciousness exists in a meaningful sense. There's a mechanism of perceiving things. Would you agree with that?
Okay.
And then I use that mechanism of perception to perceive other things, like you on the computer, my hands. But I do not have the same level of assurance that that is real, that as my consciousness is real. It's a little bit less. I still accept it. I accept the
Okay, so let's just take another example. We have myriad different dating techniques to show that I forget the name of the place now. There was I guess it doesn't matter. There was an 11,000-year-old place of worship in Syria, I think it was. Man, I wish I could remember the name. Had a scene.
Turkey, right? I think that's.
Yeah, I think it was Turkey. Turkey. So it's like 11,000-year-old, and it has all of these animal reliefs and everything on it. We have dendrochronology for matching up all of these old buildings in like in the Middle East with living trees or whatever, or from the other woodwork of the time, so we can go back to when these places existed, how much older than these places were those trees when they used them. We can easily exceed 6,000 years. We have collective organisms like an entire grove of trees that all have a network root system, so that the network of trees has to be 150,000 years old or something along those lines. So we have all of these things indicating that the truth is that the Earth is older than 6,000 years. But what have you got? We're looking for what is true. How do we determine what is true? So what do you have that says that all of these other things are wrong and the sacred fables are right? What do you got?
Well, I'm not at the sacred fables yet. We've established my consciousness exists in a certain sense. You mentioned like trees, tree history. There's a temporal quality of that I cannot demonstrate to myself to be true. I can assume it, but if I start assuming the premise, why don't I assume the conclusion and just pick anything? So I have to be very careful, and because I can't demonstrate the temporal aspect of that, I can't accept that yet. Not on its face, maybe with intent.
Okay, so we have all this evidence that the Earth is older than 6,000 years. You're looking for truth.
Yes.
And so you want to be uncertain. You want to test what is true. So we have all these things. We have all these things that show that the Earth is older than 6,000 years by a whole lot.
Yes.
And you have what to indicate otherwise?
I have my consciousness existence. I have other consciousness.
It has nothing to do with anything. Your consciousness exists if everything is old. Your consciousness still exists. Your consciousness is unchanged no matter how old the Earth is.
Can you demonstrate that, though?
How would it be any different?
It would need some. How would it be any different? Is just you have
in both paradigms, your consciousness still exists.
Yes.
Either model, no change for your consciousness.
I know other consciousness exists, and one proof of that would be aging or anything else that you don't like. I know that there is something else acting in my world, in my reality.
Which
something else
would still be the case no matter how old the world is. So, given that your consciousness remains unchanged in either model, we have all of this evidence that the Earth is very, very old. What do you have to indicate that it's young?
At this point, multiple consciousnesses, and then
no. That's for if the world is old too, doesn't change. So the facts that would be true in the old Earth are not evidence of a young Earth. If the same fact would be true in either paradigm, then it's not evidence of either one.
True, but they're both suspects at this point.
No, they're not. No, they're not.
Why is one eliminated?
The sun is the Earth is still round and it still orbits the sun in either model.
Yes,
but it doesn't matter. Well, actually, in the Bible model, the sun orbits the Earth and the Earth is flat. But that's if the Bible was true, the Earth would be flat and the sun goes around us. Hold on a second. Okay, so all this evidence that the Earth is old, and now we need something to indicate that it's young. Go.
Well, we were back at. I believe those two scenarios are both in the running. They're both suspects.
Okay, what two scenarios?
Scenario where consciousness and then matter, or matter then consciousness. And
okay, but both would remain the same in either model.
So nothing
we have your consciousness remains exactly the same in either model. So we have your consciousness and all this evidence that the Earth is really old, and then we have your consciousness is irrelevant, and what to indicate that it's young.
Let me think of that. So there's two scenarios, and you're saying they are not. The facts are not. The evidence is not indicative of one versus another.
If the same fact is true in either case,
it
doesn't matter.
Okay. So would you accept that there are two scenarios and they're both possible at this point?
No.
Would you say
creationism is not possible?
Would you say consciousness and matter?
If you're talking about biblical literalist creationism, absolutely not. It's not possible. In order to say that it's possible, you have to have a precedent or a parallel or a verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. You don't have that. You don't have a disembodied mind using magic words to speak things into being. You don't have any of that. So that's not where we're going right now. We have all this evidence that the Earth is old, including your consciousness, and then we have what indicating that it's young?
We have certainty. Or maybe there's another word.
No, we're done. Certainty just means you're unreasonable. It just means a faith-based position. You're going to conclude what you're going to conclude, and you don't care what the reason is. You don't care what the truth is. You're not going to change. You're not searching for truth. Damn sure.
I'm not at the Bible yet. I'm not.
No. If you're at certainty, then you're not even interested in the truth. You're interested in believing what you want to believe.
What's been demonstrated to me at this point in my journey for truth.
We're going to go with uncertainty, and you agreed that we would go with uncertainty to then determine, let's weigh out these evidence, what indicates that the Earth is young. You got nothing. We have all this evidence that you've dismissed without reason. You just dismiss everything. And with what we got for young, you're going to believe that it's young. That's it. That's all. No reason given.
I'm going to accept whatever's demonstrated to me. What's demonstrated to me is that the consciousness exists, and therefore the scenario where the consciousness is the foundation is possible. It's been demonstrated that
not.
that's possible.
Okay, show me that that's possible. Show me that possibility. What is the precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that possibility?
The fact that I can think of things.
Okay, so again, if a fact remains the same in either model, then it is not evidence of another one.
I'm with you there in that I think both of these scenarios, consciousness and matter as foundations, they are both completely possible. There's nothing indicating either one is true or false.
Except that one of them has all the possibilities indicated and the other one has no possibility given. None.
I can conceive of a structure, though, where this all
that
works.
Explain that structure. We have all this evidence that you're dismissing without reason, without explanation, without excuse. You're going to dismiss everything we know to be true, including your consciousness and your certainty, because you'd be just as certain, even if you're wrong, you would still be just as certain, because some people who are certain are wrong. So all of that would be the same in an old Earth. What have you got to indicate a young Earth?
The fact that it is possible that
no, it's not possible.
Consciousness can create
it's
matter.
It's not possible. None of that is possible. There is no precedent, no parallel, no verified phenomena. There is nothing. There's not a fact that you could show. There is just, you're going to believe what you're going to believe, period. No reason. That's it. You've got no reason is your reason. That's it.
Do you think it's been demonstrated to me that matter can host consciousness?
I know that you don't accept it, but yeah, it's been demonstrated. You want to say that in the immaterial, that the consciousness can somehow exist without the thing that generates it. The product exists. The contingency, the dependence is independent. How? So no. And we can't go any further because you dismiss all of this without reason. You believe something that is not supported for no reason. So we're done. There's no further discussion we can have.
You said matter generates consciousness.
Yeah, and then I also said you dismiss all of this without reason. You assume something without reason, and you give no reason, and you won't accept a reason against it. So we are done.
Well, where I'm at right now is I accept both of these scenarios as possible.
No, you don't.
I do.
One, they're not both possible. There is that all the evidence points to this. That's definitely possible. We have all the indications that's possible. You are asserting something that is not. There has no possibility given. There is none. You want to reverse things so that the product is the source. And how do you do that? You don't justify anything, but you don't give a reason. So we're done.
Because I can't know which one of them is true, I go with the
But you
one
can, and you know how to do it. You just don't care. You're going to believe what you want to believe. You're going to dismiss all of reality because you want to, and you're going to believe something that isn't real because you want to, and we're done. Yeah. All right, I'm going to close it out. Been fun talking to you.
Thank you for the chance. I'd be happy to do it again.